The United States and Israel have an important relationship when it comes to military aid. CCTV's Jim Spellman joins me now with that part of the story, a very strong relationship.
Dating back decades. The relationship goes back to the formation of Israel in the years after World War II. Since then, no country has received more foreign aid from the United States than Israel. Some estimates suggest Israel gets 95% of its weapons from the United States.
There is little doubt that Israel has vastly superior military capabilities over Hamas militants in Gaza.
It's slings and rocks versus state-of-the-art military aircraft.
Douglas Smith is a former U.S. Homeland Security official.
So where does Israel get most of its weapons?
Predominantly through the U.S., through funding through the U.S., through congressional appropriations, which we're all watching very carefully now. Their Iron Dome all comes from the U.S.
Since the 1940s, the United States has given more foreign aid to Israel than any other country. $3.1 billion this year, almost all of it to Israel's military, plus an additional $504 million for Israel's missile defense, including the Iron Dome system Israel uses to knock down Hamas rockets.
This is about Israel and Israel's right to defend itself and our strong support for Israel's right to defend itself.
But by U.S. law, it is about far more than Israel's ability to defend itself. The goal of U.S. military aid is to ensure Israel has so-called qualitative military edge, or QME, defined by the U.S. Congress as the ability to counter and defeat any credible conventional military threat while sustaining minimal damage and casualties through the use of superior military means possessed in sufficient quantity. The U.S. hopes this contributes to stability in the region.
I mean, there's no doubt that they serve as a balancing act in that part of the world. Iran, knowing Israel's capabilities and knowing that we have Israel's back, definitely helps to tap things down.
Every 4 years, the U.S. is required to file a classified assessment of Israel's QME. Israel is allowed to help create that report, working closely with U.S. intelligence officials. And in addition to the weapons Israel buys with U.S. money, it has access to a stockpile of American weapons, up to $1.2 billion worth, that the U.S. stores in Israel. It last tapped into this in 2006 when battling Hezbollah in Lebanon, and earlier this week, the U.S. allowed Israel access to replace mortar rounds and other ammunition. In Gaza, the situation is murkier. Hamas militants struggle to get arms from a variety of sources.
For many years, it was through Syria. And clearly, with the situation in Syria, that has been disrupted. Hezbollah has been a big funder of it and helps to many of the arms now they're using have come via Hezbollah. The Iranians have played a role in that, but they have had to evolve.
Evolve because the Israeli and Egyptian blockade of Gaza has made smuggling weapons into Palestinian territory more difficult. This Hamas video claims to show a homemade rocket under construction.
The reality is many of the weapons they're using, they're making themselves, a lot of these rockets. They're not very effective.
The U.S. has faced criticism in recent days from people who ask, how can the United States condemn the civilian deaths after the shelling at that UN school on one hand, while providing weapons to Israel on the other? The U.S. has argued for years that the military aid it sends to Israel is an investment in peace, but that peace cannot be created without strength. That's not an explanation the critics are going to like, but that's been the argument for decades.
Well, you say investment, but how does Israel receive this money from the United States?
Yeah, I mean, not only do they receive this record amount of aid, but they receive it in a much different way. The full $3.1 billion in annual aid is put into an interest-bearing account at the beginning of the fiscal year. The U.S. pays this interest to Israel, and Israel can then use the interest to pay back debts held by the United States. It's a unique and special relationship. No other country has these kind of terms in their military aid, Elaine.
All right, Jim Spellman, thank you so much for that.